Susan Maxwell, 1982, Northumberland. A short walk led to a serial killer. Every quiet place has a story it never wanted to tell. Sometimes it begins with a stranger, sometimes with a road, and sometimes with a child doing something so normal that no one around her understands the danger until the moment has already passed. In the summer of 1982, in a small border community between England and Scotland, 11-year-old Susan Maxwell left a tennis game and started walking home. The distance was short, the route was familiar. Her family was waiting nearby, but Susan never reached them. Cornhill on Tweed sits in Northumberland, close to the River Tweed and the Scottish border. In that part of the country, the landscape can feel open and peaceful, with farms, fields, village halls, and families whose names are known locally for generations. It was the kind of place where routines mattered, where children grew up around familiar faces, and where a short walk from one village area to another did not seem like something that should end in tragedy. Susan Claire Maxwell was 11 years old. She lived near Cornhill on Tweed with her family at Cramond Hill, a farming home rooted in the rural life around it. Her father, Fortis Maxwell, was both a farmer and a respected agricultural journalist. He had worked in newspapers, including The Scotsman, and later returned to practical farming while continuing to write. Her mother, Liz Maxwell, also had a connection to journalism and later worked in a senior editorial role. Susan was not just a name that would appear in court records years later. She was a daughter, a sister, and a child growing up in a close rural community. Accounts of the area described a childhood shaped by open fields, the River Tweed, village gatherings, and local clubs. Children in Cornhill and the surrounding farms often had a freedom that many families at the time considered normal. That freedom was not carelessness, it was part of the trust people placed in their surroundings. Roads, bridges, shops, and familiar paths formed the background of everyday life. And on Friday, July 30th, 1982, Susan's ordinary routine brought her to Coldstream for tennis. That afternoon did not begin as a mystery. Susan had been playing tennis in Coldstream, on the Scottish side of the river. Her home was on the English side, near Cornhill on Tweed, roughly half a mile. To return, she would cross Coldstream Bridge and continue toward her family's farmhouse. According to what the jury later heard, this was the first time Susan had been allowed to make that journey home unaccompanied. Nothing about that decision suggested danger. It was a short route through an area her family knew. One of the last confirmed sightings came from Karen Young, who was 15 at the time. She was traveling with her grandparents into Coldstream when she saw Susan walking over the bridge across the River Tweed. Karen knew Susan and her family, and that detail stayed with her. She later told the court that seeing Susan alone struck her as unusual. Susan was close to home, but she was still alone on a stretch of road where a passing vehicle could stop, wait, and leave before anyone understood what had happened. Another local resident, Norma Richardson, also described seeing a young girl that afternoon. She recalled a child with short brown hair wearing a lemon-colored top and white shorts, carrying or swinging a tennis racket. She believed the girl was Susan. These sightings placed Susan near the route she should have taken home. They also marked the last pieces of normality before the case moved into darkness. There was another reported detail from the wider evidence heard later. A child was said to have been seen near a vehicle with a tennis racket. The exact meaning of that sighting was never simple. It did not become a clear explanation. It became one more fragment investigators had to weigh against time, distance, and memory. Was it connected to Susan's disappearance, or was it an unrelated moment that only appeared important afterward? By the time those questions were being asked in court, Susan had been gone for years. At some point after she was seen near Coldstream Bridge, Susan disappeared. There was no confirmed scream, no public struggle, and no immediate scene that told investigators exactly where she was taken. That is part of what made the case so difficult from the beginning. A child vanished between two small communities on a route short enough that her family expected her home soon. The first fear would have been that she had fallen, wandered, or taken a wrong turn, but as time passed, those possibilities became harder to believe. When Susan failed to return, concern spread through her family and the local area. In a rural community, a missing child is not a private emergency for long. People search the places they know first: paths, fields, riverbanks, roadsides, sheds, and nearby properties. The hope is always that a child will be found quickly, shaken but alive. But Susan was not found in Cornhill. She was not found in Coldstream, and the silence around her disappearance suggested something far worse. Police launched a large search. Search dogs were used, properties were checked, and the search area expanded across miles of countryside. At its peak, hundreds of officers were reportedly involved. People came forward with memories of vehicles and movements that had not seemed suspicious at the time. One of the recurring details was the possible presence of a white van in the area. But in 1982, a van sighting was difficult to turn into evidence. There was no modern camera network, no mobile phone trail, and no simple way to track a passing driver across the country. Investigators began to consider that Susan may have been taken by someone who was not local. That possibility changed everything. A local suspect might have roots, habits, and witnesses around him. A traveling offender could appear, act, and leave within minutes. The geography of the border made that thought even more troubling. From Coldstream and Cornhill, roads could carry a vehicle into Scotland or south into England, and by the time anyone knew Susan was missing, the person responsible could have been far away. For nearly 2 weeks, Susan's family waited for news. Public appeals were made. Police continued searching and collecting information. But on August 12, 1982, the search for Susan changed from a missing child investigation into a murder inquiry. A lorry driver found a child's body near the A518 close to Loxley near Utictor in Staffordshire. The location was more than 250 miles from where Susan had disappeared. The distance was devastating. Susan had not simply been taken from a short rural route, she had been transported across a large part of the country. Her body was identified as Susan Maxwell. Because of decomposition, the precise cause and timing of death could not be determined with certainty. Reports from the investigation described that she had been bound and gagged, and the circumstances suggested a sexual motive. But the medical evidence could not answer every question her family needed answered. In the inquest in 1983, an open verdict was returned. For the Maxwell family, that meant even the formal process could not fully define what had happened to Susan in her final hours. Her father, Fortis Maxwell, spoke publicly after the verdict. The grief was not abstract. This was a family forced to live with the murder of a child and with the knowledge that the person responsible remained unidentified. The investigation then moved into one of its most difficult phases. Police had a victim, a last known route, a distant discovery site, and possible vehicle sightings. What they did not have was a suspect strong enough to explain the entire movement of the crime. The location of Susan's body led detectives to focus on people whose work could place them in different parts of Britain within a short period of time. Long-distance drivers, van drivers, delivery workers, and salesmen all became part of the wider thinking. The killer seemed to have access to the road network and the confidence to use it. Less than a year later, another child disappeared. In July 1983, 5-year-old Caroline Hogg vanished from Portobello near Edinburgh. Her body was later found far away in Leicestershire. The similarities were alarming. A young girl taken from one part of the country, then found hundreds of miles away. The circumstances pointed investigators again toward a mobile offender, someone who could move through communities without staying long enough to be remembered clearly. Then, in March 1986, 10-year-old Sarah Harper disappeared from Morley, near Leeds. Her body was later recovered from the River Trent in Nottinghamshire. Once again, distance became part of the crime. The pattern was no longer just a theory built around Susan's case. Detectives were now looking at a sequence of child murders connected by abduction, travel, and disposal far from where the victims had last been seen. The investigation grew. Officers examined delivery routes, employment records, travel patterns, and reports of suspicious vehicles. The work was huge and slow. The killer used the very thing that made modern Britain connected: roads. He could pass through a place, commit a crime, and become just another driver on a motorway or rural road. That mobility made him difficult to identify, but it created a pattern that would later matter. The breakthrough came in July 1990 in the Scottish borders village of Stow. A young girl was abducted and placed into the back of a van. This time, someone saw enough to act. Police were alerted quickly, and officers stopped the vehicle. Inside, they found the child alive, bound and gagged in a sleeping bag. The driver was Robert Black. Black was a Scottish-born delivery driver whose work took him across Britain. That fact immediately drew attention. For years, investigators had suspected that the person responsible for the murders of Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper may have been someone whose job gave him reason to travel long distances. Now they had a man arrested in circumstances that echoed the fears at the center of those older cases: a child, a van, restraints, and a driver moving through the country. Detectives began examining Black's past, his work, and his movements. Prosecutors later argued that his delivery routes and access to a van helped explain how children could be taken from one location and left far away. In Susan's case, the prosecution theory connected her abduction near Coldstream with Black's ability to travel through Scotland and return south, eventually leaving her body near the A518. It was not a simple case based on one dramatic piece of evidence. It was a case built through patterns, timelines, witness accounts, and the geography of Black's work. In 1994, Robert Black went on trial for the murders of Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper, along with the kidnapping of another child. The court revisited the last known details of Susan's life: the tennis game, Coldstream Bridge, the short walk home, the sighting by someone who knew her, and the route she never completed. Black denied the charges, but on May 19, 1994, he was convicted of the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murders of Susan, Caroline, and Sarah. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Years later, Black was also convicted of the 1981 murder of 9-year-old Jennifer Cardy in Northern Ireland. That conviction widened the known span of his crimes and confirmed that Susan had not been his first known murder victim. For the families, these convictions answered the central question of who was responsible, but even a conviction cannot recover every missing detail from a child's final day. Some parts of Susan Maxwell's case remain unclear. The exact point where she was taken has never been publicly resolved with certainty. The precise circumstances of her death could not be established at the time because of decomposition. Questions about how long she survived after the abduction and what chances there may have been to stop the offender earlier remain painful because they have no complete answer. Robert Black died in prison in Northern Ireland in January 2016. After his death, Susan's parents, Liz and Fortis Maxwell, said he would be mourned by no one. Fortis Maxwell lived for many years after Susan's murder, continuing with journalism, farming, and public life. In a later reflection, he wrote that life continues, but the pain of loss never fades. That sentence carries more weight than any courtroom summary. Susan Maxwell was 11 years old. She was walking home from tennis on a summer afternoon along a route that should have ended at her family's farmhouse near Cornhill on Tweed. Instead, her disappearance revealed the danger of a predator who used movement, distance, and anonymity to escape notice. Her story remains a reminder that some crimes do not begin with chaos. They begin quietly, in places that feel safe, during moments that seem ordinary, until one child fails to come home.